Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to talk to you about something that we wrestle with whenever we look into the idea of how do we understand other people, and that is the concept of diversity. Now, I want to use a metaphor of an iceberg when I talk about diversity to help us kind of understand a little bit of how we really grasp the concept of diversity. Now, whenever we look and study, how people think and act and are, we often use the terms demographics and psychographics. And those things come into play really well here because whenever we understand an iceberg, there's what's seen and then there's what's unseen. So whenever we look at the terms demographics and psychographics, demographics are those things that we can recognize and see, and that we can categorize people in that way. So whenever we do research methods work, and we're doing polling or surveys, or we're doing any kind of observations, things like that, and we're doing all of our happy little research that we tend to do when we're doing scholarship inside the social sciences side of communication, we are looking at how do I peg people? Like, can I put them into certain blocks just by observing? And then, of course, there's obviously the items that come from psychographics, the things that make up us, who we are, like on the inside, things that we think and feel. Those things aren't readily visible, but they're things that you can see once you get into, a group that you're trying to study and actually move into that group and work with them and talk with them and try to understand them from that side of things. So whenever we do any of that kind of social science work, we're looking at those kind of things, trying to understand people. So, that's, the basic understanding that I want to work with as we move into this thought today. So when you think of an iceberg, obviously we think of Titanic and smashing a boat into it and it being a disaster. But the thing is, why do we think of icebergs, in that way? Because there's so much sticking out of the water, but obviously below that water surface, there's a lot more under there. And it usually is, even if you're far away from what you perceive sticking up, there's still lots under there that you can still bump into. Well, if you think about diversity, it's very much the same way. So when I think about diversity, especially in a scholarly context, not as in some weird social engineering context like we wrestle with as people sometimes, but from a scholarship standpoint, I'm looking at those kind of things that I can recognize, and also the things that I should be aware of and conscious of, because again, diversity in and of itself, it gets a bad rap from people who are typically what we consider woke, and they push and focus only on certain aspects of diversity, and they push it and basically try to do social engineering with it. But diversity in and of itself isn't a bad thing. I mean, it's a good thing that we're different. We should be thankful that we're different, because if we were all identical, all the same, it'd be really, really boring. It's just like you go into an ice cream shop and all they have is vanilla. There's not different variations of vanilla. There's not even kinds of toppings to put on the vanilla. It's just vanilla. 37 buckets of vanilla. Which bucket do you want to dig it out of? It's still vanilla. That would be life without any kind of diversity. So it's really important to have diversity, because at the very least, it makes life interesting, and also it makes life worth, wrestling with and getting into, because again, when you get together with your friends, yeah, it's neat that you guys have things in common that you could talk about, that you can enjoy, but the problem comes that whenever you run out of things to talk about, it means there's probably some stuff that you agree with a little bit too much. Is there anything else out there that you maybe disagree with, or something you could wrestle with and try to form opinions on? And, not that you have to seek out problems, obviously, but the thing is that's what makes, discussion happen, because something comes up. I think a certain way about it, you think a certain way about it, and then we kind of wrestle with, is there one way that's a better way to think about it? And we come to some kind of conclusion, or we agree to disagree. I mean, that's obviously a conclusion as well. But diversity gives us that little bit of flavor, that bit of spice that happens in life. So let's talk about the idea of the iceberg. So what's above the waterline that we can see? Those are our demographics, things that we can easily talk about. So you think about things like gender, we can see that and tell that mostly, typically you can tell real quick that's a male or that's a female. And you can tell that just by looking. There we go. There's a difference. So one or the other. Pick one of the two. Then we also see race. Now, race, of course, is a little bit more. Now, I'm not talking about ethnicity because you don't necessarily know exactly what country or region a person's coming from. We just know that they are, a certain race. And so that's one thing that we see and we can categorize that way. Another thing, too, is age. Now, we won't know necessarily an exact year, and we certainly won't know the exact amount of days, but you can look at somebody and say, they look like that person's a teenager, or they look like they're in their 30s, or they look like they're in their 70s. And we can kind of peg it kind of close just by looking. So again, it's hard to disguise that. If you're 75, it's hard to look like you're 18. And if you're 18, it's hard to look like you're 75. That's just the way it is. Another thing that's readily visible is physical ability. You can see somebody if, I know when I wake up in the morning, I'd like to be able to jump out of bed, but, I'm not 18 anymore, so I don't just jump out of bed. It takes a little bit more time, and, you stand up and straighten up, and you feel your age. And you can tell by the way a person walks. You can see their gait. You can kind of tell what their abilities are. You can also look at their physical form. I mean, I don't look like someone who can lift a truck off of somebody. I'm not a bodybuilder, but there's also, folks who, look like they can't run a marathon. Also me, but, I've never tried it. I don't think I want to either, but I can cycle. You could probably look at me and say, I bet you he's physically able to cycle. Yep, I could do that. So, and you can tell certain people who are good, that's why tall people are always asked, oh, do you play basketball? It's because, well, you're tall. People who are tall gravitate towards certain things, and people who are shorter gravitate towards other things. And you can tell by physical appearance and by their physical, and you tell their physical ability. Another thing you can look at is and observe is language. And that's pretty obvious. You hear them talking, and you can hear right away they're speaking English, they're speaking Spanish, they're speaking Chinese, they're speaking Russian, and you can hear that, and that's a fairly obvious thing. And if your ear is good enough, you can tell the different regions. So you can hear oh, you're from the South, or you're from the Northeast. And if your ear hearing's really good, you can say, oh, you're not just from the South, you're from Central Tennessee, I can tell. As opposed to someone who's from Eastern Tennessee or from North Carolina or from Georgia. And you can tell the difference in accents and people. And you can tell those things. You don't have to ask questions. You can hear it. You can recognize that kind of thing. So those are some basic things that we can think of that are above the waterline. They're just observable. They're demographics. We can observe those kind of things. There they are. Now, we get into the more tricky things, and that's below the waterline, because again, you can't see what's below the waterline of an iceberg, unless of course you go down in the water with the iceberg. And so that's a great metaphor for us. So if I want to find out more about a person, if I'm doing ethnography and I want to find out more about a person or a group or a clan or a society or whatever, you have to go into it. You can't just watch. You have to get into it. You actually have to engage and actually work with and talk with the people there. And you know this from just basic people, you walk up to somebody, when you first meet them, you can size them up and see all of these demographics we've talked about right from the beginning. But all that stuff comes as soon as the stuff below the surface comes out as soon as we start talking. So I go to shake your hand, tell you who I am. Now you know my name. I tell you what I do for a living. Now you have an idea of my education level and things that interest me. And then we start going from there, and we start talking about maybe, anything from families or upbringings or hopes or dreams or all that kind of stuff that we just wouldn't know by looking at a person. And this is where diversity often gets really fun and spicy, because that's what makes up a person. I mean, the stuff that's on the above line, obviously it makes you a person too. You're going to be, a male, you're going to be a female, you're going to be 18, you're going to be 75. You're going to be those things. But, you can have animals that are male, female, that are 18 or 75. but it's the stuff below the water level that makes it fun and interesting. So let's look at some of those things. So now we start getting the idea of like your nationality. Like, oh, so where are you from? I'm from the United States, more specifically from Pennsylvania, more specifically Western Pennsylvania. And you can narrow down like where someone, their background, where they're from, and that kind of gives you an idea, even like, what they think, what they're like, what their upbringing was probably like. And I mean, it's not guaranteed, obviously, but it just helps you start to focus, to start to narrow down that understanding of them. And then you can start talking about things, obviously, like religion. Now, sometimes you can see a person's religion, so if you're looking and they're wearing a cross on their neck, chances are they at least understand or identify somewhat with Christianity. If they're wearing a Star of David, then there's a good chance that they identify with or at least support Jewish, Hebrewism and Jewish causes, Judaism, and things like that. And it could be that they're wearing this, that, or whatever. You can see the religion outwardly exposed. But again, jewelry is jewelry, and some people wear all kinds of different jewelry, or just they could be wearing a shirt that somebody else gave them or whatever. They thought it looked cool. So we don't know. And besides, how many different flavors of Christianity are there? How many different flavors of most religions, that they have multiple different flavors. So we have to actually ask questions. Oh, so you're a Christian? Yes. What kind of Christian? Then, oh, you mean like denomination? Well, because like you go from like Christian to like Presbyterianism to Reformed Presbyterianism to the RPCNA, which is my denomination that I'm in. So you can see, when you get into that, then you can really start learning about what a person thinks, what they believe. So you're really digging into it at that point. So again, those things are below the waterline that you wouldn't know by just looking at somebody, unless they're wearing a shirt that says, I am a member of the RPCNA, and assume that they're wearing that shirt on purpose, not that they just found it or it was given to them and whatever, I just needed something clean to wear that day. But, typically you have to ask and you'll find out what they believe. Then the other thing that's also tricky too, that you just typically can't tell by looking at them, life experiences. That's what makes us really who we are. I mean, the things that have happened to you throughout your life. I mean, in my years of living, I've had all these good things that have happened, these bad things that have happened, stuff that's in between, stuff that was my decision, my doing towards the good, my decision, my doing towards the bad, things that have happened to me that weren't my doing, that someone else intervened and did something to the good or to the bad. All of these things that have made me, the way I was raised, by my mom, that I have two brothers, I have one that's 2 years older, one that's 2 years younger than me. So those things shape and form a person. I was raised poor, and so that shapes a person. My status in life wasn't very high. It's not like I'm nobility or anything like that. So, that shapes a person. And, all the things that have happened to me, things that haven't happened to me yet, all that kind of stuff, that'll shape me and turn me into who I am. All those life experiences that have happened make me me. So, what's another person have, and what's going on with them? Then, of course, your heritage. What's your background of things that you go back into your history, like, I've never. As of right now, I don't have any kind of results from any kind of DNA kits or anything like that, so I don't know exactly my background. I know that, I'm Scott, Irish, English, German. I'm a mix of European, so I'm a mutt that way. But I'm definitely American, and I was born and raised in America. I'm American, so that's part of my heritage, part of who I am. And those things inform me to some extent. To some people, they inform them much more. They're much more tied into their heritage. For me, I'm not too worried about my Irish side, my Scottish bits of me, my German bits of me. I'm far more concerned about my American heritage, and that's who I am and how I look at myself. So that's my heritage and what informs how I think and act and view things. So, being guided by and informed by the Constitution, by the Declaration of Independence, by the Magna Carta, by all those kind of things that make America, America, that's my heritage, and those things inform me. Other thing from there, the idea of value systems. Again, not the same as religion, but a religion obviously, fuels that, your idea of your value systems. So, what do I think is right and good and true, and what do I think is wrong and evil and immoral? Those kind of things that drive me and make me me. They're not going to be the same as you, and that creates, sometimes a struggle, but sometimes it also creates an area where we can have good discussion and thoughtful discussion. So you start thinking of things like your family status, as I mentioned before. I don't have high family statuses, like I'm not nobility or anything like that, but I still have a status, and it's where it is, and depending on yours, that's going to make an interesting piece and part of how you're kind of viewed and how you view yourself. Another thing to think about too, your talents. Again, we talked before about like your physical ability, but that's what I can see and observe of you. But your talents, like what do you have inside that you've worked at, that you consider yourself pretty good at doing? I mentioned that I cycle. A lot of people ride a bike. That's not that big of a deal. But I also drum. So I play the drums. I've been doing that since 5th grade. So I've got a talent to play the drums. Am I awesome at it? No, but I'm good. I'm good enough at it, and I enjoy doing it. It's a lot of fun. So I have that talent. I can write pretty well. That's I'm pretty good at that. And there's other talents that I have that I can do. I like cooking. So those kind of things I have. You wouldn't know unless I, of course, invited you into that world and then presented it to you. Otherwise you wouldn't know that I could do that unless I was doing it and you happen to observe it. From there. Other thing like that, we have things like thought processes. How do you work from point A to point B? How does your brain work and get you to a certain area? Are you easily led by emotion? Are you easily led by logic? Do you try to find a balance between the two? And if you find that balance, where on that scale are you in that balance? How do you reason? How do you work through things? Are you reactionary, or are you more reserved and you process things and observe them and take them in? Those are all aspects of your thought processes. And of course, it also depends on your education level. Now, again, you can't tell by looking at a person what their education level is. You could guess, but that doesn't mean anything. Because you could have somebody who never graduated high school walking around in $1,000 suit, and you would think, oh, that person, you can tell they're educated. Or you could have somebody who has a doctorate and they're just dressed like a hobo, and you think, oh, that person's probably a dropout. Again, those are false. They're deceptive, which, on the inside you can't tell until someone asks you, till you start talking, till you divulge your education level. So, oh yes, I went through high school, or I went to college, and I went to grad school, or I did doctoral work, whatever the level is, and you have those kind of discussions with people. There you go. And then you would know. Now, obviously, as soon as it's told, then it's obvious. But then again, you don't know until we talk about that kind of thing. So those are some things that I want to be thinking about whenever I'm coming across a person. Because, again, the whole adage of don't judge a book by its cover, it's partially true. I mean, because, you can see so much, but underneath that water level, there's a lot more there about a person, which is why we have that saying. I mean, so, but you can tell to some extent a lot about a person. That doesn't mean that you should throw away appearances, because appearances do matter. Like if I'm walking down the street and you're walking towards me and you're balling up your fists and you're scowling, I'm going to make a judgment on that. I'm not going to say, oh, I don't want to judge that person because, well, they might love me actually and they're balling up their fists to raise them for joy. Like, no, that you got to have some common sense here. But the don't judge the book by the cover thing is to help us understand that, boy, there's a lot of stuff underneath that water level for that iceberg. Things that you don't know what a person has seen, what they've gone through, what they've done. You don't know what things have happened to them, struggles, celebrations, all the stuff that makes a person a person. And that's the wonderful thing about diversity, is that, again, when we think diversity, we're pigeonholed in our brains because of the current age to think of superficial things and focus heavily on that for social engineering purposes. No, diversity is so much bigger and wider, and we're made way differently, across the spectrum. But the bulk of everything is underneath, which is what truly makes us. Again, you could be a male or a female. There's not much variety there. It's one or the other. You can, be a certain age, and again, there's not a huge variety there. But from there, when we start looking at what really makes a person, is all that stuff underneath that water level. And that's why it's important to get to know people and start talking with them and seek out other companionship, because you'll find, lo and behold, there's a bunch of different kinds of people who've done a bunch of different things. And what that does is it opens your eyes more that there is more out there than just what you know. Because we then tend to get very insulated and think that we have the view of life. And in reality, everyone has their own view of life. And it's different for everybody because everyone's been through different things. So that's why it's not great to pigeonhole people in the first place, because as soon as you get past those basic demographics, we are all radically different because we've all been through different things. So think about that as you're out and about and you're meeting people, find out what's below that waterline. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for tuning in anyway. But I'll see you next time on Communicology.